Welcome in, everyone, to another edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. It is Friday, January 24th. I'm your host, as always, Tommy Brzee, and we have a great show for you today. We're going to start talking a little bit about the spring camp, get into a couple of teams from each conference that you're going to want to watch very closely. We'll probably continue this going into next week, a couple more teams that I want to get on this list, but wanted to make sure I got my initial thoughts out pretty early. Then we'll get to my All-American team for 2024. We'll get to all the players, and then I'll do a couple of position groups as we go through this thing, give my linebacker group of the year, defensive tackle, edge rushing, all that type of stuff throughout this thing. Then we'll get to the top 10 quarterbacks and heading into 2025. Very tough list to put together, but the 10 that I have here I feel pretty solidly in the top 10, but definitely up for debate just a little bit. We'll get to a transfer portal update, kind of the last one that we'll do, at least in full form. A lot of different things that have happened over the last week, including kind of the national title fallout. Notre Dame has lost a couple of players that we're going to have to talk about here. And then weekend wrap-up, just kind of all the things that have already happened throughout this week. Al Golden gets hired away from Notre Dame to Cincinnati, and a couple different things that we're going to want to talk about. But before we jump in, I do want to remind you all we get tons of questions and comments throughout the show, and the best way for you all to get your question on the screen, we can have fun back and forth here, is to use that super chat. At the bottom of the chat on the Sports Network page, you can click that $, add any comment, a question, comment you like. It'll pop up on the screen, and we can have, and we can have a fun back and forth here. Definitely want this to be as interactive as possible, so utilize that and we can have fun back and forth and talk about whatever y'all want to talk about. And we'll start with the spring games. We'll start with the spring camp that is going to happen really pretty soon. I think Hawaii starts in a couple of days here, actually, but there's definitely some big-time storylines as we head into spring and some big-time teams you're going to want to watch. So we'll kind of do what we did yesterday with the sleepers, go 2 teams every conference, and we'll probably carry this over into next week. There's definitely some things I want to talk about with some other teams I didn't have a chance to get into here, but let's go ahead and jump into this thing, and we'll start in the SEC, and we'll start with the team that's going to steal a lot of headlines, and that's the Texas Longhorns with Arch Manning. Obviously, is going to be a huge role in this, in the spring camp, and how we kind of contextualize it. He's going to have to take a huge step forward in terms of leadership. You know, Quinn Ewers was outright the motor of this team. He was the heart of this team. He was the leader, and it definitely puts you in a little bit of a disadvantage. You know, Arch Manning's got to come in there, and he's got to be ready to roll, and then the wide receiver group has to step up in a big way. Lots of young talent that I very much like. Ryan Wingo probably main among them. Khalil Lockett and Jamie French coming in as freshmen. Very talented group. It could be that they just don't pick up anyone, and you'll find out pretty much at the end of spring if they've done their job, if they stepped up in the way that they expected, or if they kind of fell back from the pack a little bit more than Texas would have wanted. And then the other group is the offensive line. You know, you lose 4 starters, tons of talent and depth on that team, no doubt about it, but definitely you're going to need some guys to step up, and the spring portal, again, could inform us where they are in that group, because definitely a very talented group. Definitely a group that could use some reinforcements, and we'll actually talk about that when we get into the transfer portal, because I think there's one of those Notre Dame guys that they could be very well in for. But very talented group, there's no doubt about that. I think throughout spring, we're just going to have to see how the early returns on Arch Manning are. You have to assume they're going to be pretty good, because they've been good for the last couple of years, but definitely going to be interesting to watch the periphery. You know, how are the wide receivers playing? How's the offensive line going in? A lot of different little things with all those players kind of walking out the door to the NFL. And then South Carolina. I think this is a team that everyone's going to want to watch as we head into 2025. You have Lenore Sellers. 2025 is going to be a huge year for him, and the sky-high expectations are going to come with that. It's going to be really awesome to see what happens with that, but the real question that I have is on the defensive side of the ball. You know, you lose a guy like Kyle Kennard, you lose a guy like TJ Sanders, and you're looking up and you don't necessarily have the defensive line that you had a year ago. That was a huge motor for what they were able to do, but at the end of the day, you do have Dylan Stewart, you do have a couple other guys that can make some big-time plays. It's going to be a little bit of a patch job. On the defensive side of the ball, you're going to have big guys step up, and then Dylan Stewart's going to have to be the absolute game wrecker that he's capable of being. So it'll be interesting to see what they do in the portal in spring. Maybe they pick up a couple more defenders that kind of to shore up their back end. I think Nick Emanwari leaving is a huge hit, but you do have Kilgore back. Definitely some very good talent on that defense, but some things you're going to have to patch, especially on that front 4, and we'll see if they can do that, and we'll see what they do in spring that could kind of inform how far along they are at that position. Moving over to the Big Ten, you do have Indiana. You're out with Curtis Rourke, you're in with Fernando Mendoza, and you got to be ready to roll. There's no doubt about that. Curtis Rourke was a fantastic player on the field, but he was also a huge leader for this team off the field. He was a guy that definitely put them in a great position to win, and a lot of these guys were more than willing to follow him into the fire. So I think Fernando Mendoza has to be the same guy. He's obviously come off as that guy when he was at Cal. It's going to be a whole new battle, no doubt about that. Walking into the Big Ten, playing for a program that just went to the CFP, you know what they want to do. So that's going to be a lot of pressure on him. We'll see how he reacts to that. And then a lot of players just kind of making their way out. After coming over from JMU, they're probably making their way to the league. Some that have a couple more years, but a couple that are finding their way off. And still plenty of talent on this roster, but some young players will have to step up for this team. Some new transfers will have to step up for this team. So that'll be a really interesting thing to watch. Really like where this team is at, but that Fernando Mendoza piece is going to be huge as we head into spring. Penn State is obviously going to be one you're going to want to watch, and the reality is you've been put on the pedestal by the way too early rankings. Kind of the same thing with Texas and Arch Manning. You got to deliver. One way or the other, you have to find a way to win a ton of games, and Drew Aller is in a position where you got to continue to take strides and maybe take a big-time stride this upcoming year, because this past year, while it was good, while you took that step forward, wasn't quite the step forward that a lot of people expected, wasn't quite as good against those elite defenses that he played throughout the year. So definitely a guy that needs to step up. And then you do have the wide receiver group. That's always going to be a big question at Penn State until they get figured out. Kyron Hudson and Devontae Ross come in from the portal, and you got to get early returns on those guys. If you don't, you have to dip back in during spring. I probably think they're going to do that anyway, if I'm being honest, but I do think there's a little bit of an opening where you got to get that figured out. And if Kyron Hudson can step up huge during spring practice, then maybe you have a little bit more comfort in your pass game going into 2025. And then on defense, they return tons of talent. I'm not overly worried about those guys, but losing a guy like Abdul Carter is huge. Losing a guy like Jalen Reed on the back end is huge. So replacing those guys is not going to be easy. Will be interesting to see who steps up. I know it's going to be Denai Dennis Sutton in the edge rushing department, but in the back end, it's going to be huge to see who steps up into that position and who kind of takes the charge. Zakee Wheatley would be the number one pick, but definitely some other guys that have to step up huge. Over to the Big 12, and I think you have to go with Texas Tech here to start. This is a team that is very, very easy to watch, and definitely a team where you get into the offseason and the portal just blows up for them. They make play after play. They get big-time players into that program, and really on the defensive side of the ball most aggressively, but a lot of very good offensive players coming into this team as well. You're keeping a couple of players. Micah Hudson might be coming back from A&M. A lot of different things happening around this Texas Tech program, but for me, it's Baron Morton. I think he's a guy that I really liked going in this 2025 season, or 2024 season, excuse me. Didn't quite hit the strides that I was expecting from him, but easily should be a top Big 12 quarterback as you head into 2025, and definitely a guy that needs to take big-time steps forward. I also think, this portal class that you brought in, Romello Height, Lee Hunter, and a ton of other guys, you're going to have to find a way to get those guys rolling early. Now, they're plenty talented. I don't think that's going to be a worry for you guys, but at the end of the day, you want to walk into the next season playing your best football, because as we all know, the Big 12 can get sideways in a hurry, and you lose a couple of games early in the season, it's a hole that's going to be really hard to dig yourself out of. So definitely a really interesting team to watch. One team that I think when you look forward to 2025 and really beyond, I think it's a program that could have some real success over the next 5 or 10 years. But at the end of the day, you need that kickstart. You need the one season that really gets everything rolling downhill. This is probably going to be that season for Texas Tech if they're going to get it done. Definitely going to be something to watch, and a team that I really like going into this year. Also a team that has some questions as we head into next year. Houston is a team that I'm really interested in, more just kind of a pet project more than anything else, but you do bring in Connor Wegman to play quarterback behind Willie Fritz, and I think it's a really, really good concept. I think that duo is definitely going to work out very, very well. Won't necessarily bring the running ability that some of the other players that he's had did bring, but at the end of the day, very talented passer, and I think they've done a great job in the portal defensively. You bring in a guy like Dean Connors over from Rice, you bring Keontae Scott over from Auburn. I think they're both very nice pickups. Now, I'm not necessarily expecting this team to light the world on fire or be a top 25 or even a playoff team in 2025, but I do think there's an opening here. I do think there's an ability for the Big 12 to go a little bit crazy next year. Maybe Arizona State doesn't play quite as well as football as they did this year. Maybe BYU takes a step back, and then the void is there for someone to step up into that, and I don't necessarily think Houston's going to get to the CFP next year. I do think they could be a team that you line up in front of them on a Saturday and you find out that your season's essentially ended because they've beaten you in the middle of November or something like that. Over in the ACC, I think we got to talk about Pitt. You have Eli Holstein, you have Pitt that are coming off a year that just turned on a dime on them. You had 7-0 and then 7-6 in a hurry, and I'm sure it felt that way for those players. You know, he had the injury to Eli Holstein. He also struggled in a couple of those games down the stretch. And you look forward to 2025. Tons of defensive talent. There's no doubt about that. Very veteran, very smart group coming back. And then you have someone like Desmond Reed leading the way on the offensive side of the ball. It should be a good team. I feel pretty confident that this should be a team that is very formidable in 2025, but they want to take that step forward. You know, they don't want to just be a team that halfway through the year is a fun story. They want to be the team that makes it to the CFP instead of an SMU team. So that's going to be something interesting to watch. Love what Eli Holstein brings to that team, but he needs to take that step forward, and this whole team needs to take that little step forward going into 2025. And then Miami. This is the one for me. This is the one that I think is the most interesting, and Carson Beck is a huge piece of that. You know, that injury is going to be really interesting to watch throughout spring, but I'm also really focused on Emory Williams. I think he's a guy that you're probably going to have step in some pretty big moments throughout this year. I think there's going to be moments where you really have to have that guy step in, make some big-time throws. We'll find out in spring how long he is, definitely just where he is, how confident he is going into next year. And then you do have Corey Heatherman coming in from Minnesota. Going to be really interesting to hear the early returns on that group and see a group that I really have high hopes for. I really like the defensive talent that they brought in, but definitely still a group that you have some questions about. So I think it's going to be a great team, but I think the questions in spring are very, very real. I think you look at Carson Beck and you say, that's definitely the biggest question, no doubt about that, but you need a little bit of a fail-safe. And Emory Williams, he's going to have to take a big-time step forward. And then Miami, you got to get that defense moving forward. You got to get that defense where it should be in terms of talent, and definitely will be a really interesting thing to watch. And overall, I think when you go throughout spring camp, it's always hard to get a beat on some of these teams. You have kind of a zero-sum game because you're playing against one another, and you don't really know which is great, which is not so good, if they're just two elite units, if they're two terrible units. So it'll be interesting to watch this unfold. But the reality is, a lot of teams become contenders. A lot of teams kind of fall out of the mix during this time of year because it's a lot of change. It's a lot of different things going on, and it'll be a really interesting thing to watch as we move into spring, and definitely some more teams that I'll talk about likely next week. But let's take our first break here, and when we come back, I'll get in my 2024 All-American team, get to all the players that I have, and then I'll do a couple of groups, you know, some teams that just have the best wide receiver group or the best defensive tackle group or things like that. So we'll break that down right after this, so stick with us.